Well, hello there. Jim Larson, and I am happy to share with you this little video which will perhaps give you some insights into some of the most important years recorded in Old Testament history. I'll just call this God's Great Incubator. God's Great Incubator. Now, you may recall, as I think about some background here, you may recall that God had entered into a covenant with Abraham 4,000 years ago. That'd be 2,000 years before Jesus. So he lived about the same distance, the other side of the cross, that you and I live on this side of the cross. And God said to Abraham, in essence, I have a plan for the world. I want to bless you and then make a nation out of you, and one day bless all of the ethnic groups in the world. Now that would become the outline for the Bible. Abraham being blessed, Israel becoming a nation, and because of Jesus, all of the ethnic groups in the world being blessed. Now, it's that second part of that little outline that I want to focus on today, the idea of a nation. Now, just for background, let me remind you that Abraham and Sarah had not been able to have children. So when God said, I'm going to bless you and you're going to have a son, I'm going to make a nation out of you, Abraham was hesitant. He lacked the faith. And he was straightforward with God. He said, you're going to have to give me something, because right now I don't see how it could happen. And so God said to him, I'm going to make a covenant with you. And he made a covenant. And you'll see this in the last half of Genesis 15. God had Abraham cut a heifer in two, and God went between that heifer, much the way that the Hittites would make a covenant in those days. So it was a form that was familiar to Abraham. And Abraham believed him. And so they had a son. And then that son, Isaac, had a couple boys. And his great-grandson, I'm going to jump right to Joseph. His great-grandson Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery. They hated him because he was a dreamer. And one of his dreams had to do with them bowing down to him. And so they decided to kill him. But before they could kill him, they had a chance to make a little money. And so they sold Joseph as a slave into Egypt. You can read that in the book of Genesis. As a slave, he becomes a part of a military man's household, and God smiles on him. You know, he's a good manager, and the man puts him in charge of everything. But his wife falsely accuses Joseph of assaulting her. So he's put in prison. And it's while he's in prison that he interprets the dreams of a couple of other prisoners. One of them happens to be the cupbearer of the Pharaoh. And the dream was that he was going to get his job back. So he meets a cupbearer in prison who ends up going back to work for the Pharaoh, who himself has a dream and he can't figure it out. It's 7 fat cows coming up out of the Jordan River, followed by 7 skinny cows. And none of his wise men can help him understand what this is about. And the cupbearer said, you know, I knew a man back in prison, and his name's Joseph, and maybe he could help you, because he helped me. So they send for Joseph, and Joseph ends up interpreting the dream. And the Pharaoh realizes that God is going to cause 7 years to be drought years, followed by 7 skinny years. So by knowing this, Egypt can prepare for the drought. And the Pharaoh says to a man who just moments earlier was in prison, languishing there, probably going to die there, he makes him his second in command. He said, this man has God on his side. So Joseph becomes a man of power. And I could give you more detail about this, except I'll say that in time, Joseph's family in the second 7 years came down to Egypt to get help because they didn't have the insight to know that there were going to be 7 good years followed by 7 bad years. So they weren't ready. So here they come down to Egypt, they run into Joseph, and they end up moving to Egypt. Now this is what God had said in his covenant making with Joseph. He said, you're going to be the father of a nation, and that nation is going to spend 400 years in a foreign country. So that's what happens. They come into Egypt as guests because they're Joseph's family. But 70 people become 71, become 70,000, 700, 700,000, and who knows, maybe 1 million people in 400 years. And when that time comes, that 400-year mark, a new Pharaoh comes along, and he doesn't know the history about Joseph. And so as the population is growing, and the number of Israelites, we can also call them Hebrews or Jews, is swelling, the Pharaoh begins to fear. He begins to fear that if an enemy came into the land, that these Hebrew people could join them and defeat Egypt. So maybe you remember the story of how he wants all of the newborns to be killed. Didn't have birth control, but population control. And as a result of this this command to kill the little boys, Moses' mother, when he's born, refuses to let him be killed. And she hides him as long as she can. And then when she realizes she can't hide him anymore, she puts him in a basket and floats him down the Nile River, sort of like, God, take care of you. And that is what happened. God took care of him. The Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe. She sees Moses. He's such a beautiful child. She says, I'm going to keep this baby. So a little boy who had been condemned to die comes into the home of Pharaoh. How's that for irony? And there he lives for 40 years. I mean, in Exodus, it happens very quickly. We're not told about his teenage years or anything. Boom, suddenly he's 40. And he's out walking around one day, and he sees an Egyptian slave master, taskmaster, beating up mercilessly on a Jewish man. And he strikes the man, Moses does, and kills him. Buries him in the sand. Somehow the word gets back to the Pharaoh. The word gets back to the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh is going to kill Moses. So he runs, and he spends 40 years out in the desert. Imagine that. 40 years learning the ways of the Egyptians, 40 years learning the ways of the desert. He's going to need both of those educations. He's going to need to deal with the Pharaoh and lead his people through the desert. He comes back when God calls him. You've heard of the burning bush. Well, it's at a burning bush that God calls him and says, get back down to Egypt and bring my people out. And we could go into detail about the 10 plagues that came upon the Egyptians as God is putting pressure on Pharaoh to let those people go. You know, there's the water turns to blood, and there's frogs and lice and locusts and boils and all kinds of things. And finally, the last plague is where the oldest child in every family dies. And that's when the Pharaoh insists that Moses take the people and go. Now, all of that background is to lead me to this point. The Jewish people spent 400 years in the incubator, as I call it. Because even though we might think this is tough, you know, they're slaves. Well, you know what they are is they're being protected. The boys never have to go into war. They're not drafted. They didn't have to form a government. They didn't have to find a way to gather taxes. What the Israelites, Hebrews, Jews, what they needed to do in Egypt was simply to grow in number, and that's what they did. What other band of people, let's say starting with 70, 100, whatever, would have grown as rapidly as they did in Egypt, under the heavy wings of protective Egypt? And when the Pharaoh told the people they were going to have to work even harder because of Moses' audacity to come back and insist that they be released, that just put Israel in a national physical fitness program. The old men and the old women and the children are all scurrying everywhere, making the bricks required that they had some stubble. That would be straw or some hay or even weeds or sticks, a bonding agent for those bricks. And so here they are running all over. And this also gains for them the sympathy of the Egyptian people. So that when they leave, they're not only strong, the Bible says there was not a feeble one among them. Imagine that. Not a feeble one among them. But they're also enriched, because as they leave, the Egyptians give them gold and silver. It's sort of like they got their wages all in one night from the 400 years that they've been in Egypt. So I like to look at those 400 years in protective custody. And they were doing just what God needed them to do, to grow in number and to grow in strength, and to be united by their difficulty. And then when they left, they would get the law and everything out in the wilderness. They'd move on to the land of promise, but not before this special time of growing and gaining stability and strength in what I like to call the incubator of God. Egypt, God's amazing incubator. I hope that's helpful. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.